There are stories that do not begin with thunder or spectacle, but with the soft, almost imperceptible rhythm of a tiny life moving with purpose. Stories that whisper rather than shout, yet leave a mark larger than the creature at their center. And this is one of those stories. At the foot of an ancient oak tree, whose roots twisted like the veins of the earth, and whose branches had measured the passing of countless seasons, a colony of ants thrived in a small, hidden world carved into the soil. The oak was their shelter, their roof, their silent witness. Beneath it, narrow corridors snaked through the earth, connecting chambers filled with warmth, activity, and life. And within that living labyrinth moved a small ant named Nai. Nai was not stronger than the others. She was not bigger, faster, or more impressive at first glance. But there was something about her that made her stand out the moment you watched her walk. A determination so constant, so quietly powerful, that it seemed to pulse with every step she took. Long before sunrise, when even the first bird had not yet cleared its throat to greet the morning, Nai was already awake. While her companions still rested in the gentle darkness of the underground chambers, she made her way to the surface. The cool air brushed against her antennae like a silent invitation. The world was still, suspended in a breath between night and dawn, and she stepped into it with the same energy she carried every day. Sometimes, Ni arrived at the colony long after the sky had turned black. The forest would be alive with the distant hoot of owls or the rustling of creatures she could not see. But she never paused. She followed the familiar scent trail home, slipped into the entrance, and made her way down the tunnels with her final reserves of strength. Inside, she placed every bit of food she had collected with astonishing care. Seeds were sorted. Fruit pieces were laid neatly. She handled every item as though it mattered, because to her, it did. When she finally retreated to her small sleeping chamber, she would clean her antennae, groom her tired legs, curl into a soft arc, and rest only enough to start again at the first breath of dawn. Ni had lived this way for seasons. Her discipline was legendary, her consistency unmatched. The older worker ants often watched her with quiet admiration. They used the rhythm of her comings and goings to mark the passing of the day. Even the queen, who had little time to observe individual workers, knew her by name. She had come to rely on Ni's unwavering devotion to the colony's well-being. But not everyone appreciated Ni's efforts. Among the younger ants was one named Kali, an ant with a completely different view of work, life, and duty. Kali preferred the shade to the sunlight, rest to effort, comfort to exertion. She rarely ventured far from the nest. When she did, she walked slowly, stopping often, collecting just enough to appear active before returning to the cool safety underground. And she mocked Ni at every opportunity. Each evening, when Ni dragged herself home with a basket full to the brim, Kali would recline lazily with a small group of like-minded companions. Sometimes, Ni arrived at the colony long after the sky had turned black. The forest would be alive with the distant hoot of owls or the rustling of creatures she could not see. But she never paused. She followed the familiar scent trail home, slipped into the entrance, and made her way down the tunnels with her final reserves of strength. Inside, she placed every bit of food she had collected with astonishing care. Seeds were sorted. Fruit pieces were laid neatly. She handled every item as though it mattered, because to her, it did. When she finally retreated to her small sleeping chamber, she would clean her antennae,
groom her tired legs, curl into a soft arc, and rest only enough to start again at the first breath of dawn. Nee had lived this way for seasons. Her discipline was legendary, her consistency unmatched. The older worker ants often watched her with quiet admiration. They used the rhythm of her comings and goings to mark the passing of the day. Even the queen, who had little time to observe individual workers, knew her by name. She had come to rely on Nee's unwavering devotion to the colony's well-being. But not everyone appreciated Nee's efforts. Among the younger ants was one named Kali, an ant with a completely different view of work, life, and duty. Kali preferred the shade to the sunlight, rest to effort, comfort to exertion. She rarely ventured far from the nest. When she did, she walked slowly, stopping often, collecting just enough to appear active before returning to the cool safety underground. And she mocked Nee at every opportunity. Each evening, when Nee dragged herself home with a basket full to the brim, Kali would recline lazily with a small group of like-minded companions. "Look who's back," she would scoff. "The colony's little machine. Do you even know how to rest?" The others laughed, but Nee did not respond. She simply smiled, a calm, gentle smile, and continued her routine. Kali's mockery grew as the days passed. She could not understand Nee's persistence. Why work so hard when the colony already had enough? Why waste energy gathering more than what was needed that day? To Kali, Nee was not noble. She was foolish. Yet Nee kept moving forward, untouched by insults, driven by an inner compass that no amount of ridicule could disturb. Seasons, however, have a way of revealing truths that words often hide, and the forest was about to teach a lesson none of them would ever forget. The signs of change began subtly, like whispers drifting through the forest canopy. A few leaves turned yellow out of season. The dawn air carried a sharper edge. The light seemed to fade a little earlier each evening, as if the sun itself were retreating from something unseen. Most ants didn't notice. Kali certainly didn't. But Nee did. She felt it with every fiber of her being. The forest was shifting, not in the gentle, predictable way it usually moved from one season to the next, but in a hurried, anxious tremor, a warning. And so Nee extended her routes. She walked farther than ever before, pushing her tired legs through brambles and grass blades heavy with dew. She risked the shadowy spaces where larger creatures roamed. She crossed streams that numbed her feet with their icy touch. She climbed steep slopes that made her basket sway dangerously on her back. Every seed she found mattered. Every crumb she carried home felt essential. Meanwhile, Kali lounged in the tunnels unconcerned. "Let the others panic," she joked. "There's always food somewhere. Nature provides." Her friends laughed, content to bask in comfort and pretend abundance was everlasting. But abundance is a fragile illusion.
As the days slipped by, the mornings grew colder. Dew froze into thin white crystals that sparkled under the first weak rays of sunlight. The forest grew quiet. Even the birds seemed hesitant to sing. Something ancient and instinctive stirred in the roots, branches, and soil, a silent drumbeat announcing the winter's early arrival. The first frost came suddenly.
One morning, Nye stepped out of the nest and felt the ground stiffen beneath her feet. A delicate layer of ice coated every surface. The world glittered, beautiful and deadly. Seeds that were once soft and easy to gather had hardened. Berries shriveled and clung to frozen stems. The fragrance trails she followed so faithfully had vanished into the cold air. Still she tried, still she walked, still she searched. But nature had closed its doors. That same afternoon, clouds rolled in with unusual speed. The wind shifted direction, carrying the unmistakable scent of snow. By nightfall, the forest was blanketed in white. Snow fell thick and heavy, piling up in deep drifts, swallowing the landscape whole. The oak, once a towering guardian, now stood silent beneath a dome of ice. Every entrance of the ant colony became choked with snow. Every familiar path disappeared beneath layers of frozen silence. The colony reacted quickly. Alarms spread. Workers rushed through the tunnels. The queen issued immediate orders: seal the entrances, preserve heat, conserve energy. No one would leave until spring returned.
Inside, thousands of ants huddled together, bodies pressed close to share warmth. The walls of the chambers radiated a faint natural heat, but it wasn't enough. The air grew heavy with breath and tension. Every heart beat a little faster. Every antenna twitched with unease. For the first few days, the colony ate with routine confidence. The storage chambers, meticulously filled during the months of abundance, offered hope. But soon something became painfully obvious. There was not as much as they thought. Nay had always known that abundance could evaporate in a heartbeat, but many others had taken it for granted. And now nature was demanding payment. Food disappeared at an alarming pace. Large seeds vanished. Dried berries were consumed. Even the smallest crumbs, ones usually ignored, became valuable. The queen's advisors counted and recounted the supplies, whispering in growing panic. If the winter continued at this pace, the colony would not survive. And all at once, the consequences of Kali's choices and those who followed her became clear. Kali had contributed almost nothing. She had laughed while others worked. She had wasted days lounging in comfort, assuming someone else would carry the burden. Now she had no reserves,
No strength, and nothing to offer. Her bravado dissolved into fear. She hid in the shadows of the nest chambers, trembling as hunger gnawed at her small stomach. Her companions of leisure were no different, weak, frightened, ashamed. Nee, meanwhile, though exhausted, remained steady. The queen sought her counsel. The older workers leaned on her presence. Even as her strength waned, Nee carried herself with an inner light. She did not blame. She did not scold. She simply observed, listened, and tried to think. Something had to be done. Days passed. Weeks passed. The snow outside only grew deeper. Inside, every ant felt the walls of hunger closing in. It was then that Krya, one of the older workers, remembered something, an ancient practice long abandoned. When winters were particularly harsh, a few brave ants had once ventured outside through a tiny emergency vent to gather clean snow. Melted, it became water. Water brought clarity. Water bought time. The idea spread, but fear held everyone still. Who would dare step into a world frozen enough to kill? No one spoke. No one volunteered, until a shaky voice whispered,
I will." It was Kali. Every head turned, every antenna flicked in disbelief. Kali stood there, thin, shivering, but with something new in her eyes. Not arrogance, not laziness, but determination. A spark lit by guilt, remorse, and a growing understanding of responsibility. The queen studied her for a long moment, then slowly nodded. The emergency vent was unsealed. A tunnel of icy air burst inside, chilling everyone to the bone. Kali stepped forward. Her friends tried to pull her back, saying she was too weak, that she would not survive. But she shook her head. "I have taken too much," she said softly. "I need to give something back." Then she vanished into the snow. Outside, the world was a white desert. The cold cut into her like a blade. Each step felt like walking through frozen glue. Her antennae stung, her legs quivered, her breath faltered, but she moved anyway, step by painful step, driven by an urgent need to atone. She found a patch of clean snow and gathered as much as her trembling legs could carry. Then she turned back. By the time she re-entered the colony, she was barely conscious. Her legs had turned stiff, her movements were erratic, but she had done it.
The older workers melted the snow into precious drops of water. It wasn't food, but it was enough to revive the weakest ants, to buy a handful of precious days. And for the first time in her life, Kali cried not from fear or frustration, but from gratitude and humility. From that day forward, no one recognized her. She went out again and again, every 2 or 3 days, facing the frozen world with a quiet heroism she never knew she had. But outside, the winter was growing worse, and inside, the food was nearly gone. The colony was reaching a breaking point, and soon they would have to choose a path no ant had ever dared to take. The world beneath the snow had grown unbearably quiet. Inside the colony, the air was thick with hunger and fear, and every small sound echoed like a reminder of how fragile life had become. The workers no longer moved with their usual rhythm. Their steps were slower, unfocused, as though the weight of the freezing season pressed down on their tiny bodies as heavily as the ice above. Despite the dimness in their eyes, there was one thing they all shared now, a deep, unspoken awareness that time was running out. The droplets of water that Kali had brought sustained them longer than expected, but water alone could not fill stomachs. It could not strengthen limbs. It could not replace the food reserves that had vanished far too quickly. Every ant felt the ache of emptiness spreading through their frame, a hollowness that tightened their movements and clouded their minds. The queen, usually serene and composed, now stood with trembling antennae as she watched her colony weaken. She had ruled through many seasons, but never one like this. Never a winter that seemed intent on swallowing everything in silence. In one of the central chambers, the queen gathered her eldest advisors. They formed a circle, antennae touching, communicating in soft vibrations of urgency and sorrow. They spoke of dwindling rations, of collapsing tunnels, of larvae crying quietly in the darkness. Their words trembled like thin ice under weight. "What remains?" asked one advisor. "We have very little," whispered another. "Perhaps enough for a few days, but not enough for all." The queen closed her eyes. The burden on her heart was heavier than the snow crushing the earth above them.
She searched for a solution, any spark of hope, but none appeared, until she felt a faint presence approaching.
Nay, her steps were uncertain, her legs thin from exhaustion, yet something inside her still glowed with the same steady resolve that had defined her from the beginning. The advisors fell silent. Nay bowed her head slightly before speaking, her voice low but unwavering. "I have something to show you." There was no confusion, no hesitation. Something in her tone made every ant understand that this moment mattered. Without another word, Nay turned and began walking down an old corridor rarely used by the others. The queen and her advisors followed, each step echoing the gravity of the unknown. The deeper they went, the colder the air became. The tunnels narrowed, dust clinging to the walls like memories of forgotten days. At last, Nay stopped beside a small cracked opening, just wide enough for a single ant to pass through. She gestured for them to enter. And there, inside a tiny chamber hidden from everyone else, was a secret that made the queen's breath catch. A small collection of seeds, tiny dried berries, fragments of roots gathered with meticulous care, enough to feed the weakest ants for several days, maybe even longer if rationed carefully. A miracle hidden in the earth. The advisors gasped. The queen stared at the small reserve with disbelief. "Nay! How is this possible?" one of them whispered, tears pooling in her eyes. Nay lowered her gaze. "I gathered them over the seasons. When others rested, I worked a little more. When there was abundance, I stored a little aside. I never knew if it would be needed, but I hoped it wouldn't."
One advisor shook her head. This could save you," she said softly. "You, of all ants, deserve to survive." Nye's antennae trembled, not with fear, but with certainty. "What is my survival worth if the colony perishes?" she replied. "Everything I have done, every step I have taken has been for all of us. If I kept this for myself, it would betray everything I believe in." Her words settled into the room like warmth seeping into frozen soil. The queen approached her, gently touching Nye's forehead with her own. "There is no greater strength than the strength that gives itself away," the queen murmured. "Your spirit carries the wisdom of many generations." Nye only smiled, soft, tired, full of acceptance. The hidden reserve was transported with reverence, each seed lifted as though it were sacred. The colony gathered in the central chamber as the food was distributed. Larvae, trembling from hunger, received portions first. The sick and the weakened followed. Even Kali, whose transformation was still unfolding, was given her share. As the food touched her tongue, Kali felt a wave of grief that shook her to the core. Every moment of laziness, every mockery, every wasted day replayed in her mind with brutal clarity. She had taken freely from the labor of others without ever giving anything of value in return.
And now, Nay, the one she had belittled, was giving up her last reserves for her. Kaylee approached Nay, who sat quietly near one of the tunnel walls, grooming her antennae with slow, deliberate motions. She looked smaller than ever before, her frame worn down by the relentless demands of the season. Kaylee lowered herself to the ground before her. "Nay," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I don't know how to look at you. I've mocked you, I've judged you, I've wasted my days while you gave everything. And now you've saved all of us, including me." Her tears dropped onto the soil. "I am ashamed." Nay paused her grooming and placed a gentle antennae on Kaylee's head. "We all learn at different times,"
she said softly. "What matters is that you have learned now." Her calmness was overwhelming, her forgiveness disarming. Kaylee felt something inside her crack, not in pain, but in awakening. A part of her, long dormant, finally opened its eyes. The next hours were filled with careful rationing, shared warmth, and whispered hopes. But even with Nay's hidden reserve, reality remained dire. The food would not last long. Hunger still stalked the corridors. The winter showed no signs of weakening.
It was then, in the quiet murmur of despair, that a bold idea took shape. One of the elder workers, with a trembling voice, recalled an ancient legend of a distant cave where larger animals sheltered during the harshest winters. Bears and raccoons took refuge there, and in their wake they often left scraps, frozen berries, seeds, shells of nuts, sometimes even insects that lay dormant. Reaching that cave would require immense courage. The snow was deep, the cold deadly. It was a journey few could survive, but it was a chance, perhaps their only chance. Slowly, one by one, the ants lifted their heads. They knew what had to be done. They would leave the colony. They would venture through the frozen forest. They would carry their larvae, their future, on their backs, and they would risk everything to reach the cave that might save them. The Queen gave a solemn nod. The decision was made. The mission would begin at dusk. And in the hushed chambers of the nest, where every ant felt the trembling weight of the unknown, Nay closed her eyes with peaceful acceptance. Whatever awaited them, she had fulfilled her purpose. She had lit the way.
Dusk arrived like a slow exhale from the frozen forest. The last traces of daylight faded behind the skeletal branches of the oak above, and the temperature sank sharply, as if the world itself were narrowing into silence. Deep inside the colony, the ants gathered, small bodies trembling from cold, hunger, and the unspoken weight of what was about to happen. No one pretended to be brave. They simply understood that bravery was the only path left. The Queen stood at the forefront of her weakened colony, her antennae lifted in solemn resolve. Around her, dozens of workers prepared themselves and the larvae for the journey. They worked with tenderness, securing each tiny life onto the backs of the strongest ants, reinforcing woven straps made from fibers and softened roots. Kale stood among them, transformed. Only a short time ago, she had been the symbol of indifference, drifting through the days without ambition or care. But now her movements were steady, her posture grounded. She stepped forward and accepted the responsibility of carrying the youngest larvae, fragile, trembling, barely alive. Her heart pounded, but not with fear, with purpose. The emergency vent was unsealed once more. A rush of icy air surged through the passage, chilling everyone to their core. The chamber lights dimmed as shadows stretched across the earthen walls. Then, with a gentle flutter, a moth, thin, delicate, awakened from its winter slumber, entered the tunnel, shimmering in the faint glow of bioluminescent fungi. It was the same moth that had guided the scouts earlier, carrying the memory of safe paths like a lantern woven from instinct. The Queen bowed her head slightly. She whispered, "Guide them."
Dusk arrived like a slow exhale from the frozen forest. The last traces of daylight faded behind the skeletal branches of the oak above, and the temperature sank sharply, as if the world itself were narrowing into silence. Deep inside the colony, the ants gathered, small bodies trembling from cold, hunger, and the unspoken weight of what was about to happen. No one pretended to be brave. They simply understood that bravery was the only path left. The queen stood at the forefront of her weakened colony, her antennae lifted in solemn resolve. Around her, dozens of workers prepared themselves and the larvae for the journey. They worked with tenderness, securing each tiny life onto the backs of the strongest ants, reinforcing woven straps made from fibers and softened roots. Kaylee stood among them, transformed. Only a short time ago, she had been the symbol of indifference, drifting through the days without ambition or care. But now her movements were steady, her posture grounded. She stepped forward and accepted the responsibility of carrying the youngest larvae, fragile, trembling, barely alive. Her heart pounded, but not with fear, with purpose. The emergency vent was unsealed once more. A rush of icy air surged through the passage, chilling everyone to their core. The chamber lights dimmed as shadows stretched across the earthen walls. Then, with a gentle flutter, a moth, thin, delicate, awakened from its winter slumber, entered the tunnel, shimmering in the faint glow of bioluminescent fungi. It was the same moth that had guided the scouts earlier, carrying the memory of safe paths like a lantern woven from instinct. The queen bowed her head slightly. "Guide them," she whispered. And so it began. One by one, the ants stepped into the freezing night, each carrying a precious part of the colony's future. The snow reached up to their bodies, pressing against their legs with a cruel weight. The cold stung their antennae, numbed their limbs, slowed their breathing. Yet they pushed forward, driven by something stronger than discomfort, driven by survival, by unity, by an unbreakable thread of shared destiny. Above them, the sky was a deep, endless blue. Stars hung like shards of ice. The moon watched silently.
The moth fluttered ahead, its wings catching faint reflections of moonlight as it danced through the bitter air. It led the ants over hills of snow, across frozen patches of earth where cold winds howled like distant predators. The journey was slow and punishing. Every step cost strength they barely had left. Kali felt her legs trembling under the weight of the larvae on her back. Her breath was shallow, her vision blurred by the burning cold. But every time doubt attempted to creep into her mind, she thought of Ni's calm resilience, Ni's sacrifices, Ni's quiet, unwavering devotion to the colony. It was as though Ni walked beside her, whispering courage into her shaking body. Hours passed. The night deepened. The snow thickened. A few ants stumbled. Others supported them. No one was left behind. Finally, after an eternity of frozen silence, the dark opening of a cave appeared, an archway carved by time and the rhythm of larger creatures. Faint warmth seeped from its depths, carrying with it the musky scent of hibernating animals and the traces of food they had left behind. It was a dangerous refuge, one where giants slept, but to the ants it was a sanctuary. They crossed the threshold with their last reserves of will. Inside, the air was warmer, soft enough to thaw the stiffness in their limbs. The ground, though rugged, offered stability. The faint scent of berries and nuts lingered in pockets of shadow. Roots hung from the ceiling like threads of life. The ants placed the larvae gently on a patch of soft soil, warmed by the earth's quiet breath. Workers collapsed to the ground, panting, shaking, but relieved to feel safety, real safety, surround them at last. They found fragments of food scattered in corners, seeds dropped from a raccoon's paws, remnants of berries frozen but edible, even a few insects still dormant in crevices. It was not abundance, but it was enough. Enough to strengthen the weakest, enough to wait out the last brutal stretch of winter. Kali moved slowly across the chamber until she found Nee, lying near a curve of stone. Nee's breathing was faint, her antennae still, her legs curled gently beneath her. She looked peaceful, as if resting after a long journey.
Kali knelt beside her, the warmth of the cave brushing lightly over them. "I wish you could see what your strength has done," she whispered. "I wish you could see who you've helped me become." Nye's antenna twitched, just barely. A small, soft gesture, a final acknowledgement. And in that quiet moment, Kali felt her heart break open, not from sorrow, but from understanding. Nye had lived for the colony, and because of her, life was continuing. The larvae stirred faintly, and the remaining workers regained color. A future was unfolding right before her eyes. Days passed in the cave. Food was rationed with precision. The ants slept in clusters, sharing warmth, whispering stories of Nye in the dark. They spoke of her courage, her foresight, her endless labor through the seasons. Her name became a memory, a lesson, a guiding light. And then, one morning, a drip of water fell onto the ground. Then another, then another. The cave trembled with a subtle warmth. The thaw had begun. Outside, the world was shedding its icy skin. Snow melted into rivulets that trickled down rocks. The forest exhaled, waking from its long hibernation. Buds began to stir beneath the soil, ready to burst into life. The ants prepared to return home. They followed the moth one last time, tracing the scent of the path they had taken months before. This time, the journey was easier. The snow had thinned, softened, turning to patches of slush. The cold no longer bit their legs. The air felt kinder. When they reached the old oak, their hearts tightened. The entrance to the colony was partially collapsed, buried under layers of ice and debris. But they did not despair.
They rebuilt. With newfound strength, determination, and unity, they worked through the soil, reconstructing chambers, clearing old tunnels, raising new walls. Where one ant faltered, another stepped in. Where one struggled, another offered support. Kali worked harder than anyone. Her movements were steady, deliberate, fueled not by guilt anymore, but by gratitude and clarity. She carried heavy grains. She dug deep tunnels. She guarded the larvae like a shield. The other ants no longer laughed at her. They looked to her for guidance. Days of rebuilding passed until at last the colony was whole again. A new generation of larvae wriggled in warm chambers, nourished and protected. The queen stood tall, her body glowing with renewed purpose. A great gathering was held in the heart of the restored nest. Every ant, from the smallest worker to the eldest guardian, came forward as the queen climbed onto a raised root and addressed her colony with a voice rich in emotion. She spoke of the impossible journey they had survived together, She spoke of unity and sacrifice. And most of all, she spoke of Nay. Her work fed us. Her foresight saved us. Her spirit carried us through winter's darkest night. And her example will light our path for generations to come. A wave of gentle vibrations rippled through the chamber, an entire colony paying tribute to the one who had given everything without ever once asking for recognition. Kali stood quietly among them, her head bowed. She felt Nay's presence everywhere in the tunnels she had carved, in the seeds now resting safely in the storage rooms, and in the warmth of the larvae that would soon become the next generation of workers.
Nay had become more than a memory. She had become a foundation, an invisible pillar holding the entire colony upright. And the story of her life, her work, her vision, her sacrifice, was no longer just hers. It belonged to all of them now, a reminder that even the smallest creature can shape a destiny far greater than itself.